Hey everyone, back again. Okay, let's get on to part two, or our part two, of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's Manufacturing Consent, where this episode is going to cover chapters 2 to 4, which is mostly going to cover Eastern Europe, so Poland, Romania a bit, and Latin America. And the next episode, we're going to look at the case of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But if you're just tuning into this, go listen to part 1. Obviously, really, you got to go read the book. That's what you got to do. You got to read the book. I can only give you so much here. And in this episode, we're going to be talking, obviously, about violence. We're also going to be talking about cases of sexual assault, again, in no great detail, but they will be topics we'll cover here, and the lack of attention given in cases where the assaults can be attributed to Americans or American influence in various parts of Latin America. Yeah, let's hop right into it, into Chapter 2, Worthy and Unworthy Victims. Now, you can learn a lot about who media view to be worthy and unworthy human beings by the amount of attention that they give to their deaths. Where some people, if they die or if they are murdered, are given a lot of attention and others are not. And this isn't just like just a foreign policy type appealing to American interests abroad thing. You see it everywhere. You see it especially when we consider things like race. The lack of attention given to murdered and missing Indigenous women in Canada and the United States, when you'll get all of the news about women and girls, where you'll get all the news possible about a murdered white girl, which, again, that should get attention. My concern is not that that gets attention. My concern is that all of these other people barely get a peep out of the mainstream news. And yet there are documentaries made about people by victims if they're white, if they look the part, they've embodied the right kind of like white fragile innocence, then they're going to be amplified and so on. Especially if the perpetrators can be used to justify more xenophobia or tightening borders, for example. Then it's going to be a huge scandal that needs to be revealed. But you can learn a lot by how much press attention is given to certain victims over others. Now here, in this chapter at the beginning, they're going to compare the amount of coverage of Jerzy Popieluszko in Poland and the murder of many religious leaders in Latin America. And we're going to see that Jerzy Popieluszko, who was an anti-communist priest, his murder was amplified in news media so much, while the murder of dozens of journalists, of religious leaders, of women in Latin America by American military personnel or American-funded death squads in Guatemala, Chile, El Salvador, all these people are given no attention at all. And this will show how some lives are considered more grievable than others if those people harbored the right ideological framework, which is wild, because I thought life transcended ideology, but we see very well that that is not the case at all. And we see how this is a kind of identity politics that has been on display forever. But of course, it's when identity politics is criticized, it's only when it's, black people trying to identify the specific ways in which they experience racism, and then they're accused of splintering the left or of distracting people from the real legitimate mission that is like class conflict or resolving class conflict or something. When that is an absolute, this total illusion, we see very well how mainstream media has long done this thing called identity politics, in whose lives are more grievable than others, depending not only on their physical identity, but on their ideological affiliation, which I would say is even a more pernicious brand of identity politics. Based off of your ideological beliefs will determine whether or not you are worthy of any kind of grief. Now, Jerzy Popieluszko was an anti-communist Catholic priest who was murdered by security police officers in 1984. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I mean, it was horrible. The way that he was murdered was horrendous, and it deserves attention. But it's very interesting how we got very little information, or very little attention was given to the murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador just a few years earlier. And he was opposed, on the other hand, he wasn't opposed to communism, he was opposed to the US-backed military government within El Salvador. And he was murdered while giving a sermon, which is like, you'd think that the Christian right in the United States would have been really upset about that, but they really weren't. You know, they're actually quite cool with it. Not overall. I mean, I don't want to homogenize. And there were many, many other specifically targeted US-backed assassinations of religious leaders and journalists, just like we're seeing in Gaza. How many journalists? More than 150 about that have been murdered in Gaza. And someone would be hard-pressed to give another example of any conflict in which there have been conflict. God, I see, even I slip up with stuff like that. Any kind of invasion like this where there has been this many murdered journalists, and it's like, it's horrendous. But the same with El Salvador and Guatemala in the late 70s and 80s, which I'll give a little bit of backstory to, but just to give you kind of the introductory glance, all these murders weren't given nearly as much attention as Jerzy Popieluszko in Poland. In fact, they show, because part of this book is them counting the number of stories and mentions of certain victims over others, and they concluded that Popieluszko's coverage to that of other victims, it was 137 to 170 times more likely to be covered than other victims. And that's purely because he was murdered, or his murder could be attributed to communists while he was fighting communism. And that satisfied the fifth filter of the propaganda model, in that it peddled the anti-communist message as communism is the regime, or it's the economic framework that is going to encourage state-sponsored assassinations, all while American-inspired assassinations don't get any attention at all, or get very little attention by comparison. And another thing they show is that in those cases where mainstream news actually would cover these other victims, they always do this thing as Chomsky and Herman show, where they say something like, they talk about, these newspapers would have to talk about the quote-unquote omnipresence of violence and the inherent tragedy of human life. And there's something very similar at the beginning of like the COVID-19 pandemic, when, what's that guy's name? Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, came out because they were failing miserably, as were many other governments failing miserably because they were totally unequipped to actually deal with a pandemic of that extent. How they do this thing, and he did this thing where he's like, when being presented with the data of the number of people who were dying from COVID, he was like, well, one death is a tragedy. And it's like, okay, wait. So you're saying that because there was one death, that everything else beyond that is just superfluous? And this really goes back to the Stalin thing, where it's like, his quote is like, yeah, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And we really see that where we see whose lives are amplified, like for each of their deaths are really like amplified, and who, in which cases, each death is just reduced to a statistic as a means to discredit the validity of those lives. So 870 murdered civilians on October 7th, despite the 1,200 number, which is a flat-out lie, as everyone should now know, as in terms of quote-unquote the actual number of innocent civilians, about 871, I think is the number around that. That is given way more attention than the tens of thousands of murdered women and children in Gaza, because of course then it's just a statistic. And statistics, then, there's no meaning behind them. You can just dehumanize the people. It's like they're ants at that point. Just this number going up, like with COVID deaths. I don't mean to compare the two to say that they're in no way the same at all, but I'm drawing attention to the fact that there is this similar trend in discrediting or disqualifying the value of human life by just pointing to like the inherent tragedy, or saying that any death is a tragedy, so therefore it's like, how can we say this many more deaths is that much worse? Are we not then treating any single death as a tragedy? Why does this deserve more attention? When it does deserve more attention. Now, one of the other things in the case of worthy victims is that news networks are often very quick and willing to attribute blame not to the people who are responsible, but to the ideological systems motivating them. So in those cases, suddenly the media are very tuned in to ideological influence. Like in the case of there being a terrorist attack, and if they're able to attribute it to a Muslim person, then suddenly it's a sign of the inherent violence of Islam, for example. And then suddenly it can be contextualized within a broader ideological matrix. But if it's the other way around, and the perpetrator is some white guy, then suddenly it's just an individual, right? Then it's suddenly, there's no motivating factor beyond just that person. It couldn't possibly be the result of patriarchy or of capitalist influence or anything like that. Of course not. No. This person was just acting alone. So it's interesting to see that in the case of worthy victims, so those victims that the US cares so deeply about, it's so quick to point to like communism or Islamic terror or whatever, Russia today or something like that. And they're able to really contextualize it with no problem. But if it's the other way around and suddenly the victims aren't worthy, they're suddenly completely unwilling to contextualize October 7th as being a response to Israeli occupation and violence. Like, they're not willing to do that. Even though it's a historical fact. Like, I'm just saying a fact. It's just not going to be given any airtime. In fact, if you were to try to publish something like that, again, just straight up facts, you'd lose your job. If you're working with the New York Times, you're done. Your life is over if you were going to actually publish facts. But that just goes to show that facts is not nearly enough. So to use their examples here, in the case of Popieluszko in Poland, who was murdered by communist security forces, they were immediately willing to attribute this to communism. And they were like, Popieluszko was an active insurgent against communist authority. But they didn't give the same kind of weight to Oscar Romero in El Salvador, who was murdered by US-backed forces, even though he was fighting against US power. He was his own brand of insurgent, but not taken seriously, or he wasn't the right kind of insurgent because he was fighting against American imperialism. So how did they explain it when they did actually give it some attention? Well, they chalked it up to some extremists that went too far in their deployment of American power, going after Romero. And this is another tactic in the U.S. mainstream media system, and this is connected to the refusal to contextualize the deaths of unworthy victims, like Oscar Romero here. One of the things that they do is to say that when they do recognize that violence had ensued, they're going to chalk it up to some kind of like extremism that isn't actually part of the very fabric of American life, or the U.S. backed, or the U.S. military backing these groups and everything like this. And they will do this, and they have done this, to encourage many of their regime changes, where they frame the insurgent government that is trying to oppose U.S.-backed militarism. They will often frame these governments as being the extreme ones, as though U.S. occupation is not in itself extreme. So it's like Hamas are branded as terrorists, and they get all of the ire associated with that term, but no terrorism is attributed to Israel despite occupying this land for 75 years. And it's interesting to see what gets to count as terror, where if you just look at one of the most illuminating things, I mean, for those of you that are maybe not so familiar with some of the other stuff I've covered here, go check out the episodes I've done on Nora Erakat's Law and the Question of Palestine. But if you want a kind of shortcut in looking at the current state of Israeli occupation and terror, look up the A, B, and C zones in the West Bank. So West Bank, not Gaza, no Hamas, none of that. In fact, it's, just run by a U.S. puppet government in the West Bank, really. I mean, they just banned Al Jazeera. It's like, okay. Where's the outcry from the New York Times about that? You won't see it. But look up the A, B, and C zones in the West Bank and just ask yourself, is this something you'd tolerate in your backyard? The answer is yes. Then you should go live there and be part of the victimization of the Israeli military. And if you're not okay with it, which I assume most people wouldn't be, then you can join us in our pleas and calls to end Israeli occupation. But I digress. In the case of El Salvador, though, they framed Romero's murder as just the case of some extremists. And then what they did is they were like, the government, which is a U.S.-backed military government, was this moderate force that is being threatened by these extremists that are coming in from all sides. They would oppose right-wing and left-wing extremism. But this is one of the really clever tactics of U.S. foreign policy as it is translated into news, in that it can determine who people view as being extremists. So they view not the government itself as being extreme in the kinds of violences that it has like unleashed on so many people around the world. No, it's the freedom fighters who are the extremists. You know, if they have some kind of like religious background, especially if it's non-Christian religious background, then they're these extremists. And the same can be seen in the case of the sexual assault and murder of 4 American churchwomen in El Salvador. There was Maura Clark, Jean Donovan, Ida Ford, and Dorothy Kazel, who were all murdered in El Salvador. Americans, all murdered. So the U.S. authorities and media were quick to attribute their deaths to some nonsense, like some absolute, like, just inconsequential nonsense, like breaking a petty law, like as though, like, these women somehow deserved this, where they had, like, some contraband in their suitcases or something when they were flying in. I think it was one of the excuses. And when it was revealed that wasn't true at all, when it was revealed that the National Guard had actually raped and murdered them, members of the National Guard, the U.S. was quick to brand the perpetrators as simply these bad apples. You know, they are not indicative of the U.S. military or National Guard at all. Now, major news networks even received evidence that the El Salvadorian military had been planning their capture in advance, and the networks didn't follow through on this at all. Like, they didn't follow through on this at all, which is, like, wild. So this wasn't a response to something illegal they had done, which isn't justification on its own, right? That's not, there's no justification for this. But it was actually planned in advance. Now, the judges in this case had to flee because they were getting so many death threats, which was a common thing, especially under the U.S.-backed death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala, who were murdering journalists and judges, many of them. Now, the same was the case for the judge in Romero's case, because that was the state of U.S.-backed violence in these countries. And we will see more in the next chapter, pretty much just in the next chapter when we look at Nicaragua, where Nicaragua had opposed successfully American aggression, and then it would be branded by the U.S. mainstream media as this extremist, violent place, even though that wasn't the case at all. Now, in the case of Guatemala, for a little bit of backstory, it was a democracy that was being a little bit too democratic, where in 1954, the U.S. overthrew its democratically elected leader and installed a military regime it would control for decades. It was the same thing we will see in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, it was trying to do in Vietnam. The U.S. has done in so many other places. It has instilled its own military regime to forward its own geopolitical agenda. Same kind of like we saw in Venezuela, where there was a democratic election that the U.S. was immediately like, we don't believe these results, we don't respect them at all. Where it's like, when it goes against American interests, then the principles of democracy go out the window. It's like in the case, too, of international consensus on Israeli apartheid and genocide. Suddenly the U.S. doesn't care about democracy or Israel. And it's really interesting to see how that goes. Or in the case of the illegal U.S. embargo of Cuban goods, how the international community democratically opposes this, and the U.S. just doesn't care. The U.S. can just be like, we're going to do whatever we want. And is this really the world we want to live in? Like, how is this not what we are all allocating our energy towards? But yes, it's, I don't know, trans people are the problem, or identity politics, or whatever nonsense they've successfully made you focus on instead of these, geopolitical violences. So the military regime in Guatemala that began in the mid-50s would continue there for decades. And Guatemala would then be used as the United States' training ground in a lot of cases for its death squads and for its counterinsurgency tactics. It wasn't just them, though. I mean, the U.S. got a lot of input from Israel and its own terrorism on how best to spot terrorism, because Israel had been committing, and before Israel even existed, the death squads that were set up there under Irgun by people like Menahem Begin, who would eventually become the prime minister of Israel, were terrorists, even recognized by the West, terrorists. The U.S. learned a lot from them and adopted their techniques in their own application of terror, in not just in Guatemala and these places too, but they tried to in Vietnam, but they confronted a landscape they weren't used to and got absolutely decimated. Mexico, different examples like this, like really horrendous. But Guatemala was an exceptionally violent country, not by the people, but a government violence backing U.S.-backed governments backing death squads that were just slaughtering people, like entire villages, killing journalists, judges, like absolutely horrendous. And the U.S.'s stance, very much like its stance towards Israel, is like, yeah, it's not great, but it has to happen. And then when the government would change, then the U.S. would be like, oh yeah, they were actually pretty bad, but the new one's good. We side with the new one. And then the new one would continue these death squads and other murder campaigns, and the U.S. wouldn't even bat an eye. They wouldn't care. They'd be like, oh, maybe don't do that. Which they would then do with the Khmer Rouge that they were tacitly supporting. They'd be like, oh, the Khmer Rouge. Oh, one of the presidents, was it Jimmy Carter? Came out and he's like, yeah, this is one of the most horrendous organizations ever. We're gonna keep supporting them. No, it's better them than the other communists. We can't have that. Now, in the case of Guatemala, it wasn't a total secret what was going on. Groups like America's Watch, Amnesty International, they called out this U.S.-backed slaughter in Guatemala and El Salvador. And what did the U.S. do? They said Amnesty International and America's Watch were just, they're just left-wing, they're biased communists. Just like how any criticism of Israel is just branded as anti-Semitism. Amnesty International can call out Israel's genocide, but no, now they're all just anti-Semites. Or the UN votes against Israeli occupation, or the calls for Israeli withdrawal from Palestinian territory. It's like, then they're all anti-Semites. And it's very convenient to see this weaponization of anti-Semitism work in this way to justify continued violence against Palestinians. Just like this weaponization of, left-wing bias is used to justify continued American aggression or backing of death squads and murder campaigns in Guatemala and El Salvador. Now, this has been most of kind of like the backstory geopolitically in Latin America. Now we're going to move into Chapter 3 and talk a little bit more about the news coverage here, but with still more of the substance of what had occurred. So Chapter 3, legitimizing versus meaningless third world elections, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. Now, the United States loves to paint its allies' elections as righteous and democratic, and its enemies' elections as corrupt and dictatorial, like we just saw last year with Venezuela. Venezuela had elections. The U.S., the entire U.S. media circus leading up to the Venezuelan elections over the last few years has been like, the people there are so deeply oppressed under communism, they're suffering so brutally. Of course, it would be intolerable for them to accept that the people actually there didn't hate it. Same with Cuba. Like, the U.S. was experiencing so much, or like U.S. news was really responsible for making people think that people in Cuba were unhappy, when people in Cuba were exceptionally happy and still are. The reason that if they are angry, the reason for it is because the U.S. has made it really difficult for them to live their lives because they've embargoed them and kept Cuba in this state of arrested development for the past several decades. So the U.S. in the 80s, El Salvador and Guatemala had some elections. U.S. loved it, right? The U.S. was so for it because their U.S.-backed ally got in there. They were very happy with that. Nicaragua's election, on the other hand, that was framed as this dictatorial capture of political power. How it wasn't legitimate, how it should be investigated, how it was just like essentially a terrorist state. And this was just inspired by the fact that the U.S. hated Nicaragua because they had a communist government, somewhat communist. Now, so the U.S. backed the Contras. For those of you that don't know, I mean, this is the whole Iran-Contra affair, where the U.S. were backing the Contras that were these like opposition groups within Nicaragua that they were going to support in order to try and overthrow this government. But in order to do so, the U.S. had to break certain sanctions on Iran. So there was an embargo on Iran, and the U.S. broke that embargo to sell them weapons that they would then use to back the Contras in Nicaragua against the Sandinista government. And it was just like a U.S.-inspired effort to have a coup in Nicaragua. But the way that this was framed among the mass media was that these are righteous rebel groups fighting against authoritarianism within Nicaragua because they're fighting the communists. Whereas in the case of like Oscar Romero, who was fighting against a military government that was committing way more violence than the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, way more violence in El Salvador, similarly with Guatemala, the United States mainstream media were not covering these people as righteous opponents to dictatorial power because they don't even, like, what they're even capable of recognizing as a dictatorship is just totally filtered to them by their own ideological prejudice against Americans' enemies or America's enemies. Now, did the mainstream media care that in El Salvador in the early 80s, the only opposition newspaper to exist, well, there was a couple of them, they shut down because a bunch of people were arrested at them by the U.S.-backed military police. A bunch of the journalists were arrested, and the other newspaper was bombed by these people. But of course, this isn't a sign of a dictatorship, of like repression. The U.S. mainstream media couldn't even fathom criticizing these actions like that. So 30 or more journalists were killed in El Salvador and in Guatemala. 48 in Guatemala between 1978 and 1985. 48 journalists. That's wild. That's wild. Now you consider Gaza, it's like 150 more journalists have been murdered in not 7 years, in a year and a half. Like, horrendous, right? Absolutely horrendous. Meanwhile, no journalists were murdered in Nicaragua. And even the Contra-backed newspaper enjoyed a relative freedom, could actually like publish stuff, and it enjoyed freedom of the press. Now, am I going to sit here and pretend as though there wasn't a certain amount of repression against them? There was, but there's no comparison to Guatemala or El Salvador. Like, no comparison. They could still publish. Were they getting threats? Yes. Were these threats anywhere near El Salvador, those of journalists in El Salvador or Guatemala? No. No comparison. But the mainstream news networks didn't cover that fact. They didn't cover the fact that in Nicaragua, this apparent insurgent guerrilla force, the legitimate kind of the Contras, there was no mention of the fact they still had their newspaper working with little to no resistance. Additionally, El Salvador and Guatemala were cracking down on unions and organizers. So during the elections of the 1980s, the left-wing parties had to go underground to avoid being killed. Now, about 700 civilians were killed every month leading up to the 1982 election in El Salvador. 700. And the U.S. was approving of this. It approved this. The mainstream news was focused on Nicaragua, focused on Iran, because this is right after the Iranian Revolution. Of course, Iran was this horrible dictatorial state. No mention of this, where, like, if we were to actually, be these rational, neutral, objective people, there's no way we can possibly even allocate any energy criticizing a country like Russia or Iran when we see Israel murdering tens of thousands of children in Gaza. Like, every single child is by definition innocent. It's just how that works. If you disagree, I think that you need to really evaluate your moral compass. And so those are thousands of innocent people killed by Israel and Israel alone. Oh, but it's Hamas's fault. There's no justification for it. It doesn't matter if Hamas is the worst force on earth. The Germans didn't experience this kind of brutality. Like, it's unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. Now, despite this fact that there was this much repression in El Salvador, hundreds and hundreds of civilians being slaughtered monthly leading up to the election, when the election came through and it was their U.S.-backed person got in, the U.S. was very happy. They were very happy and they thought it was such a righteous election, just totally discounting the fact that civilians were being murdered constantly. Now, by contrast, it also explains why Nicaragua's elections that would confirm support for communism, these elections were demonized. And the propaganda model shows this. Like, they are just totally correct in the way that they frame this propaganda model as determining how news media are going to cover different parts of the world, different events, depending on who gets in power, depending on who the victims are, various violences, and so on. Now, there's so many examples of this, really. If you're listening, feel like commenting the different examples. We could have a running repository of just examples of this through the comments section, and everyone can read them. And that puts us here into Chapter 4, the KGB Bulgarian plot to kill the Pope. Free market disinformation as news, quote-unquote news. Now, in the cases of El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, the media mostly parroted government propaganda. They mostly just parroted whatever the government was telling them. So, like, how much of this is just that news media didn't know the facts? Is this an excuse for them? No, because then they shouldn't be covering it. Or they should be going and, like, doing their actual investigative reporting. They shouldn't just be, like, taking whatever the U.S. government tells them is the truth and then running with that. Now, with we can contrast this with the 1981 shooting of the Pope, where the media played a more substantial autonomous role. They weren't just parroting U.S. talking points here. Now, this is kind of a tricky story, but I mean, some of the backstory here. So the media immediately attributed the shooting to a KGB/Moscow-backed Bulgarian with no evidence at all. Like, no evidence supported this at all. Now, the shooter's name was Mehmet Ali Agca, and he was a right-wing anti-communist, and this, of course, was totally ignored. He was an anti-communist, so he was one of the U.S.'s boys, right, as far as the ideological framework goes, where Agca became the embodiment, despite his anti-communism, the embodiment of Soviet terrorism as it was feared by Israel and the U.S. Israel played a part here as well. So what evidence was there? Well, Agca had actually visited Bulgaria, which was under communist rule, and they used this as evidence to say that, well, it was obviously inspired by communism. Same thing was used against Lee Harvey Oswald to explain, like, an a communist influence for murdering JFK because he had been in Russia. I mean, that's a whole other thing. People really clung on to that idea, even though it's one of those things you look up first, David, before you just start rambling. Wasn't it that? So he did go to Russia, but then he was there for, I don't know if he was there for a few years. And then he was like, what did he say? He was like, there aren't enough bowling alleys or something. There wasn't enough bowling alleys. And so he went back to the U.S., which is like, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald killed JFK. I'm not denying that. But, like, it seems like the communist-inspired angle isn't correct. I'm just maybe for other reasons, I don't know. But the USSR inspired one does not seem correct. Now, like I said, the belief that Agca had been inspired by the communists was inspired by the idea that he had been in Bulgaria. But he was also he visited like 10 other countries in the same time period. He was going around through all of Europe traveling. But none of those countries are given as evidence, right? Even though they are U.S. allies and stuff, they weren't given as evidence of him then being, an anti-capitalist type, communist trying to overthrow everything. But that was how it was framed, that he was a communist because he had visited Bulgaria. Did I say anti-capitalist? I mean, like, if he'd visited a capitalist country, he would have been anti-communist, and that would have not fit their narrative. Now, as it turned out, he had connections with the Turkish right-wing groups, the Turkish right-wing group called the Grey Wolves, who were not communists. Like, they were not at all. And this was just totally ignored. So he would then go and try and assassinate the Pope, and he did not succeed, but that did not stop the mainstream news from immediately attributing this to the KGB and to the Soviets, because that served their purpose. Just like when the Soviets shot down that Korean plane, rightfully so, deserves all of the anger that should deserve. But meanwhile, there's very little attention given when Israel shoots down a Libyan plane. Now, one of the other pieces of the puzzle was that the Italian government had furnished the US and news outlets with quote-unquote evidence that turned out to be false, that linked Agca to Moscow. Now, all of this evidence was debunked, but that didn't stop them from still parroting these ideas because they fit within the propaganda filter. And so an interesting thing happened where some of the first journalists who were writing upon it, even though they were using false evidence, became authorities on it. And this is one of the things that you'll often see among many of the mainstream news sources, is that they'll end up citing themselves in previous stories they've done as evidence of what they're now covering. And you'll see this especially in the coverage of Israel, or like the atrocities on October 7th. They'll use evidence of things that they've covered in the past as evidence of what had occurred, instead of actually doing research or actually conducting investigations into new facts or any new information. And this is how there's a kind of media recycling and siloing and echo chambering of this information. So some of the people responsible for this, for the attempted murder of the Pope, were people like Sterling, Hens, Ledeen, and there was a few others of them that became these authorities on the matter. Very similarly to the way in which there were these unknown people who started to write very mysteriously for the New York Times and stuff about Hamas's violences on October 7th, like about how there were many babies murdered, how people had claimed to have seen images of babies being murdered, that none of this has been proven to exist at all. And if they did, please name the babies. I would love to know their names so we can all properly mourn them, because I don't know why so willing to just let these babies go without proper funerals or any proper recognition. Please name them so we can properly properly mourn their deaths. But this is an example of atrocity propaganda, as a way in the case of the plot to murder the Pope. It was used as justification for further U.S. encroachment upon Soviet territory, and this has been used. It was in the case of like Judith Miller, who wrote the piece about there being about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction to justify the U.S.'s going into Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, using this as a pretext to go into Iraq under the auspices of like fighting the war on terror. Or there was the case in the early 90s, again with Iraq, where there was this woman who, Nasrallah was her name, who had claimed to have seen Iraqi soldiers like murdering babies in a hospital, like ripping them out of incubators and stealing the incubators. And this was, she got a position she was given a platform in Congress to give this testimony about how horrible and barbaric the Iraqi military is, and pretty much just to tell the American people why the U.S. should be involved in Iraq. should go in the Gulf War, to create the Gulf War, to go in and like liberate Kuwait from Iraqi violence. And this kind of atrocity propaganda is very useful in these ways because they play on people's sympathies, and they often use children as justification for these unbelievably horrendous U.S. interventions in so many parts of the world. Again, not to back Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Granted, I don't think anyone really knows what that was about. But in any case, as horrendous as that is, it pales in comparison to the amount of violence that the U.S. would then inflict on Iraqi civilians. How hundreds of thousands of murdered Iraqis. Like, there's no comparison. But their violence is framed as justified, as righteous, as necessary, whereas Iraqi violence, rightfully, is framed as being unacceptable, demonic, and everything else like that. But it's not recognized like that. It's recognized like the U.S. is super justified and everything. Like in the case of Hamas being this totally terrorist force, always framed as like these ultimate perpetrators of anti-Semitic violence. Meanwhile, all of Israel's violence against Palestinians over the last 75 years is treated as necessary. Oh, there's nothing to do about it. It's complicated, when it really isn't. It really isn't at all. But this is how it's framed, and this is how the cycle is able to continue. But this story about the plot to kill the Pope, of course, nobody questioned it. Nobody questioned the facts because they fit within the American ideological framework with the anti-communist filter. So it just goes without questioning. People just accept it. Of course, there's no mention about the fact that Ledeen, one of the writers of these stories, he worked for the CIA. I mean, he's an absolute CIA hack. And there's so many examples of this. And of course, the mainstream media didn't cover this at all or use this as to smear this guy, of course, because he was speaking their language. Yeah. We'll move from this into Indochina, as it's talked about in the next episode. We're going to look at the cases of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia and show American aggression there, American violence, and the U.S. media's response to that violence. But yeah, add comments about any other things you're thinking about. And anything I got wrong, if there's anything I omitted that I shouldn't have, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. And yeah, on that note, take care.